The palace had known many dawns. Some carried celebration. Some carried scandal. But this one arrived without color, a pale, reluctant light spreading over the stone facade of Buckingham Palace, as though even the sun understood that something irreversible had happened. At precisely 6:12 a.m., the first internal call was placed. It did not ring loudly. It did not need to. Within minutes, the coded phrase began moving through secure lines, through offices still dim with early morning lamps, through corridors where portraits of monarchs past seemed to watch with unmoving comprehension. London was still waking when the bells began to toll. Slow, measured, unforgiving. Across the city, the sound rolled outward from Westminster Abbey, crossing the Thames, echoing off glass towers and ancient brick alike. Commuters paused mid-step. Taxi radios crackled. A nation that had rehearsed this moment in theory now felt it in sound. King Charles III was dead. Inside Buckingham Palace, protocol did not grieve. It activated. The camera drifts down a long corridor lined with crimson carpet. Footsteps, soft, controlled, purposeful, move toward the king's private apartments. Black suits appear where navy once dominated. Ties are exchanged. Expressions narrow into professional stillness. The machinery of succession had been built for this hour. Yet at the center of it all, in a private sitting room just beyond the public imagination, sat Camilla. No announcement had yet reached the world, but she already understood. The room was heavy with the scent of extinguished candles, curtains half-drawn, a silver tray untouched on a side table. The air carried that unmistakable stillness, not silence, but absence. For decades, she had walked beside him, through scrutiny, through ceremony, through rehabilitation of reputation and restoration of duty. She had stood just behind the throne, close enough to feel its weight, far enough to never claim it as her own. Now, the throne stood alone. She did not weep immediately. There was no collapse, no visible fracture. Instead, there was recognition. A queen consort does not inherit power. She shares it. And when the sovereign is gone, so too is the authority she reflected. Outside, flag began their slow descent to half-mast. Inside, a private secretary approached with a leather folder pressed against his chest. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him. "Ma'am, the Prime Minister has been informed." She nodded once. There would be statements. There would be choreography. There would be the carefully constructed language of continuity. But beneath it all, a single, unspoken reality pressed inward. She was no longer protected by the living presence of a reigning monarch. The camera lingers on her hands, resting calmly in her lap. The wedding ring still catches the morning light. Hours later, the announcement became public. Broadcasters interrupted programming. Anchors shifted tone. A black border framed the screen as the words appeared. The king has died peacefully this morning. Crowds began forming outside the palace gates. Not loud, not chaotic, just present. Flowers appeared first, then handwritten notes, then silence. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, another shift was already underway. In a chamber at St. James's Palace, preparations began for the accession council. Documents were laid out in precise order. Inkstand positioned, chairs aligned with mathematical symmetry, because while one reign had ended, another had already begun. Prince William was now king. There is no intermission in monarchy. The moment the sovereign dies, the heir becomes a successor. Instantly, automatically, without ceremony. Ceremony merely confirms what law has already decided. Back in her sitting room, Camilla was informed gently, though she already knew. "Your Majesty." The A began, then hesitated. Language was shifting even in real time. Titles were not emotional. They were constitutional. And constitutionally, everything had changed. She had been queen consort. By afternoon, she would be styled queen dowager. The difference seemed subtle to the public ear. It was not. The camera moves through a private office where printers hum quietly. Updated briefing documents emerge. Security classifications adjust. Staff rosters are reviewed. Influence does not vanish dramatically within palace walls. It recalibrates. A knock at her door. Another folder. This one thinner. Immediate status adjustments. The phrase was clinical, almost cold. Inside were outlines, not of grief arrangements, but of position, revised order of precedence, seating at proclamation ceremonies, security assessments pending review by the Home Office, military appointments to be transferred upon confirmation by the new sovereign. Each line was neat, each paragraph measured, and each represented something that, only yesterday, had been unquestioned. Shared authority is a fragile architecture. It stands only while two pillars remain. Now one had fallen. Across London, the first rehearsals for morning began. Gun salutes were scheduled, routes for the lying-in state examined, foreign dignitaries alerted through diplomatic channels coded with decades of tradition. But here, in the quiet of a private chamber, Camilla faced a more intimate reckoning. She rose slowly and crossed the window. Beyond the glass, the palace gardens were beginning to fill with staff moving in purposeful diagonals. Security teams adjusted perimeter placements. Vehicles arrived in understated succession. The world was moving forward, and she was standing still. The camera pauses behind her shoulder, framing the garden below, a kingdom preparing to shift. She had always understood her role. Consort, support, companion to the crown. She had endured years in the public wilderness before earning the quiet acceptance that came with steady duty. Literacy campaigns, visits to shelters, patronages that required patience rather than applause. She had not sought to redefine monarchy. She had sought to steady it. But monarchy is not sentimental. It is structural, and structure does not pause for grief. By early afternoon, black crepe had been affixed to palace railings. Royal websites transitioned to monochrome. Social media accounts issued the formal statement in restrained serif font. The new king was preparing to address the nation. And somewhere within the palace, wardrobe staff were selecting garments for Camilla's first appearance not as consort, but as widow of a sovereign. The distinction mattered. The camera cuts to St. James's Palace, where members of the Privy Council gather beneath chandeliers that have illuminated centuries of transfer. The Accession Council reads a proclamation. Prince William Arthur Philip Louis is now, by the death of our late sovereign. The words echo in the chamber. Outside, a herald repeats them to the public. Trumpets sound. A new era begins. But inside Buckingham Palace, the sound does not feel triumphant. It feels distant. Camilla listens to the broadcast from a small television positioned discreetly near the fireplace. The voice of the herald rings with clarity. The nation now had a king, and she, for the first time since her marriage, did not stand beside one. A subtle realization begins to take shape. Her title would remain dignified, respected, but it would no longer carry the proximity that grants influence. Military equerries who once reported directly to her office would be reassigned. Patronage reviews would follow. Invitations would shift toward the new queen, not out of cruelty, but because monarchy is momentum, and momentum always favors the future. The camera drifts through empty corridors, past framed photographs of state visits, banquets, moments where she stood slightly behind Charles, angled toward him, aligned with his pace. Those images were now history. Not current. History. Late afternoon, light begins to fade. A senior official approaches with quiet deference. Ma'am, the new king has requested a private audience later this evening. There it was. The first meeting not as stepmother to the heir, but as dowager to the sovereign, power rearranging itself across generations. She nods again. Composure remains her discipline. But beneath it, a question begins to form. Not of entitlement, but a place. Where does a queen consort stand when the king she served is gone? Evening descends over London. Crowds outside grow thicker, though still hushed. Candles flicker against iron gates. The air carries a shared national breath, the space between mourning and transition. Inside, Camilla walks once more through the private rooms she had shared with Charles. Her hand brushes the back of a chair, the edge of a desk. A book left partially read. These objects would remain, but their ownership, like everything else, was about to shift under the invisible gravity of the crown estate and sovereign designation. Even walls in monarchy belong to the institution, not the individual. She pauses at a portrait of Charles taken during his coronation, robes heavy with symbolism, expression measured yet resolute. For a moment, the enormity of it all presses through the discipline, not only the loss of a husband, but the loss of shared sovereignty. The echo of bells outside returns, carried faintly through the thick glass. Slow, measured, unforgiving. The palace had fallen silent in one way, but in another, it had never been louder. Because succession is not gentle, it is precise, and precision leaves little room for sentiment. Night settles fully now. A final knock at the door. Another folder, smaller this time. Camilla opens it carefully. The heading reads, Immediate Status Adjustments, Phase 1. Her eyes move across the first line, and for the first time since dawn, her breath catches, not in grief, but in recognition of what this new chapter demands. The crown had fallen silent, but the consequences were only beginning to speak. The ink had dried before the emotion had settled. By the time the proclamation was read aloud at St. James's Palace, the transformation was already complete in law. The nation heard the herald's voice declare a new sovereign. Trumpets answered. Crowds murmured. Flags shifted in the wind. But inside the palace walls, the quieter declaration was the one that mattered most. Camilla was no longer queen consort. The title had not been stripped. It had simply expired. In constitutional monarchy, proximity to power is not inherited. It is conditional. And that condition is singular, the life of the sovereign. The camera glides through a long chamber where senior courtiers sit at an oval table polished to a mirrored sheen. Before them, documents edged in black. Beside them, seating charts revised overnight. No raised voices. No visible drama. Only procedure. Her Majesty will now be styled Queen Dowager. One official states softly, as though announcing a change in weather. The phrase carries weight precisely because it carries restraint. Queen Dowager. Dignified. Historical. Removed. The word consort had implied participation in reign. Dowager implies remembrance of it. Hours earlier, she had signed correspondence with a royal cipher that intertwined her initials with those of a reigning king. Now, that cipher was retired. Archived and arranged specific records maintained by the Royal Archives, cataloged according to conclusion of the era of Charles III. Titles in monarchy do not dissolve in public spectacle. They recalibrate in quiet rooms. The camera moves to a smaller office adjacent to the private secretary suite. Two heraldic advisors stand before a framed coat of arms. Subtle changes are already being discussed. The sovereign's arms, which had once been quartered and adjusted to reflect her status as consort, would revert exclusively to the authority of a new monarch. Her personal standard would remain, but its precedence would fall. Precedence is everything inside these walls. At banquets, it determines placement. At state openings, it determines procession. At investitures, it determines visibility. And visibility in monarchy is influence. By mid-morning, the Accession Council had concluded its formalities. In the gilded rooms of St. James's Palace, the new king, Prince William, no longer entitled but sovereign in law, had signed the oath to preserve the Church of Scotland and affirmed his commitment to constitutional governance. The world watched history turn its page. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, a different page was being annotated in red. A senior aide enters Camilla's sitting room with composure rehearsed in decades of service. Ma'am, there are several immediate adjustments requiring acknowledgement. The folder is opened. Inside, 3 categories. Title, authority, affiliation. The first is already understood. The second requires explanation. Under British constitutional custom, a consort exercises no independent governing power, but proximity grants access. Access shapes council. Council shapes tone. Without the sovereign, access narrows. Military colonelcies once held ceremonially in her name are now subject to reassignment by the new king. Royal warrants granted to her household must be reviewed. Patronage confirmations require renewal under the authority of the reigning monarch. Nothing is revoked dramatically. It is simply transferred. The camera cuts to a ledger in the master of the household's office. A clerk draws a thin line through Office of Her Majesty the Queen Consort, and beneath it writes, in precise ink, Office of Her Majesty the Queen Dowager. The difference is semantic. The consequence is structural. In another wing of the palace, seating arrangements for the upcoming state mourning service are being drafted. Once, she would have occupied the place beside the sovereign, slightly behind but central in frame. Now, her position will be one seat removed. The camera lingers on the diagram. A small shift in placement, a visible shift in era. Outside the palace gates, the public still refers to her as Queen, and technically they are not wrong. The honorific remains, but inside, precision matters. The style becomes Her Majesty Queen Camilla, only in courtesy. Official documentation will increasingly adopt Queen Camilla, Dowager. Language becomes architecture. At midday, a call is placed in the cabinet office. Security classification is reviewed in coordination with the Home Office. Threat assessments, once calculated for a reigning consort, are recalibrated for a senior royal without executive proximity. Protection does not disappear. It adjusts, a subtle downgrade in tier. One fewer vehicle in convoy. One fewer liaison embedded in intelligence briefings. The echo of boots on marble changes rhythm. In a conference room lit by muted daylight, communications advisors gather. Media statements must reflect continuity without suggesting influence. Future engagements must be approved through the new sovereign's office. There is no malice in this. There is hierarchy. Meanwhile, Camilla listens, not defensively, not emotionally, but with the comprehension of someone who has lived long enough within monarchy to understand its grammar. "I expected as much," she says quietly. And she did. She had watched this process unfold once before in history books, when queens consort of earlier reign stepped back into dignified shadow. Consorts shine because the crown reflects light upon them. When the crown moves forward, the light follows. The camera shifts to the royal muse, where liveries are inspected. Insignia bearing the joint cipher Charles and Camilla are being cataloged for archival storage. They will be preserved, not destroyed. Preservation is how monarchy handles conclusion, not erasure. In the throne room, rehearsals for the new king's first address continue. Cameramen adjust angles. Technicians test microphones. The throne itself, symbolic, ceremonial, remains unchanged, but the figure who will sit upon it has. In a private moment, Camilla walks through the picture gallery alone. Portraits of former queens consort line the walls. Women who navigated similar transitions, some beloved, some contested, all ultimately absorbed into the narrative of their husbands' reigns. She pauses before a portrait of Queen Alexandra, consort to Edward VII, who too became Queen Dowager. History offers precedent. It does not offer comfort. Late afternoon settles into a deeper shade of gray. A memorandum arrives from the College of Arms. Heraldic updates will be published formally within the month. Her coat of arms will no longer be impaled with that of the sovereign. In heraldry, impalement signifies union. Its removal signifies independence, but also separation. The camera closes in on the parchment draft. The lines are beautiful. The symbolism is absolute. As evening approaches, preparations begin for the first official audience between the new king and the Dowager Queen. It will not be confrontational. It will be ceremonial. A reaffirmation of mutual respect. Yet beneath the civility lies unspoken understanding. Authority now flows in one direction. In a sitting room adorned with cream silk wallpaper, they meet privately. No cameras, no recorders. Just two figures navigating the careful geometry of succession. "You will always have my respect," the king assures her, and she believes him. But respect and power are not the same currency. When she leaves the room, her expression remains composed. Yet the corridor feels longer than it did the day before. The palace clock strikes 9. Across the Commonwealth, statements of condolence continue to arrive. Foreign leaders speak of continuity, of stability. They do not speak of dowagers. Inside her private desk drawer, Camilla places a retired cipher, carefully wrapped, beside personal letters from Charles written decades earlier. Objects of intimacy remain hers. Symbols of sovereignty do not. The night deepens. Staff numbers in her immediate office are reduced by 2, reassigned to assist with the new queen's expanding schedule. A small adjustment, a significant signal. She stands once more at the window overlooking the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. The crowds have thinned, but candles remain, trembling in the London wind. For the public, she remains part of the story. For the institution, she has moved into its margins, and margins in monarchy are permanent. Yet there is no bitterness in her posture, only recognition. The vanishing crown is not torn away. It recedes, quietly, methodically, lawfully. The next morning's newspapers will feature her image beside that of the new king. Captions already shifting in tone. Dowager Queen attends proclamation. A subtle rewriting of position. The camera drifts upward toward the palace facade, illuminated against the night. Within those walls, the transfer of authority is complete, not because anyone demanded it, but because the Constitution, unwritten yet immovable, required it. And as she closes a folder marked Status Adjustments, Phase 1, a second envelope rests beneath it, unopened. Its heading reads, Residential Review. The envelope had remained unopened through the night. It rested on her writing desk. Cream paper, embossed seal, the language of the institution pressed into wax. The words Residential Review carried none of the emotion they contained. Outside, London moved beneath a sky the color of pewter. The nation was still mourning. Tributes still gathered at the gates of Buckingham Palace. News anchors still spoke in softened tones. But inside the palace, mourning had already made room for inventory. The camera drifts across a corridor lined with framed photographs. State visits, garden parties, private smiles caught between public obligations. These walls had witnessed decades of shared rhythm. Morning briefings, late-night conversations. The quiet familiarity of two people who had weathered storms long before the crown rested on their heads. Camilla breaks the seal. The letter is precise, formal, unapologetic. In accordance with constitutional protocol and crown estate governance, residences allocated to the sovereign revert to the authority of the reigning monarch upon the end of a reign. Revert, the word is elegant. It is also final. Clarence House, their London home for years before the accession, had always been more than an address. It was where routine replaced ceremony, where dogs wandered freely, where laughter did not require microphones. It was tied not merely to Charles the King, but to Charles the man. And now, legally, it was tied to neither. The crown does not recognize sentiment as ownership. The camera cuts to a meeting room in the Lord Chamberlain's office. Blueprints are unrolled across a polished table. Senior advisors speak in tones of logistical neutrality. The residence will be prepared for transitional occupancy. One says. Another nods. Security perimeters will adjust to reflect the status of the dowager. There is no hostility, no urgency beyond efficiency. It is simply understood houses connected to the sovereign are not personal estates. They are instruments of monarchy. Meanwhile, at Highgrove House, staff move carefully through gardens Charles once tended with near religious devotion. The hedges are immaculate. The soil still bears the impression of his boots. Highgrove had always felt separate from London, softer, more human. It was where philosophy replaced protocol, where environmental passion shaped landscape. But Highgrove, too, is owned by the duchy, a possession of the heir, and the heir is now king, which means the duchy has changed hands. The camera lingers on a gardener, standing still for a moment longer than usual. He removes his cap as if acknowledging not only a man lost, but an era concluded. Inside the drawing room at Clarence House, Camilla walks slowly past a mantelpiece lined with framed photographs. Weddings, christenings, a coronation, decades compressed into still images. An equerry approaches quietly. Ma'am, the new sovereign's office has requested an occupancy timeline. There it is, not an eviction, a timeline. She nods once. How long? 3 months for formal transition. 6 for full reassignment. 3 months to leave rooms that had shaped daily life. 6 months before another presence fills them. The camera follows her into a private study. Charles's chair remains angled slightly toward the window, as though he might return to it at any moment. Papers still rest in ordered stacks. Loss is easier to process when it feels symbolic, harder when it feels logistical. In another wing of the palace, Inventory officers begin cataloging items designated as personal property versus crown-held furnishings. The distinction is ancient and meticulous. Personal letters, hers. State gifts received in official capacity, the crown's. Furniture purchased privately, negotiable. Artwork acquired under sovereign patronage, retained. The process is neither cruel nor compassionate. It is structured. The camera moves through a quiet exchange between two clerks reviewing a ledger. Item 47, French commode, 18th century. Acquired during state visit? Yes. Crown property. A red mark is placed beside it. Across town at St. James's Palace, preparations continue for the official morning ceremonies. The new king's schedule expands with constitutional obligations, audiences, addresses, diplomatic receptions. Momentum shifts forward, and in its wake, space must be cleared. Back at Clarence's house, Camilla enters the garden. The air carries early autumn chill. Leaves scatter gently across gravel pathways. For years, this had been sanctuary, a place where the monarchy's noise softened into something almost ordinary. She kneels briefly beside a flower bed Charles had favored. So much of monarchy is performance. Gardens are not. They reveal care without applause. A senior advisor joins her outside. There are alternative residences under consideration, ma'am. The phrase lands carefully. Alternative. She rises slowly. Which ones? The advisor references a discreet list. Smaller estates, apartments within palace grounds, properties historically assigned to widowed consorts. None carry the scale of Clarence's house. None carry its memory. But monarchy does not allocate by memory. It allocates by relevance to reigning authority. The camera pans upward to the facade of Buckingham Palace. Even here, her apartments are subject to review. Suites designated for the reigning couple may be repurposed. Walls that once heard private laughter will soon echo with new footsteps. The shift is subtle, but relentless. That evening, she dines alone in a room built for two. Silverware glints beneath candlelight. A place setting opposite hers remains untouched. Absence is texture. It fills space. In the days that follow, moving crates begin appearing discreetly inside corridors. Staff handle objects with reverence. Each piece wrapped, cataloged, documented. A portrait of Charles is removed from one wall. Not discarded, but relocated to archival preservation. Preservation is monarchy's way of closing doors gently. Yet the closing is unmistakable. At Highgrove, a final walk is arranged before formal transfer procedures begin. The new king's office will determine its future use. The camera follows her along winding paths bordered by wildflowers. Every tree holds memory. Every bench carries conversation. But ownership now belongs to the Duchy of Cornwall, and therefore the sovereign. She pauses beside a small oak sapling they had planted together years ago. It stands taller now, rooted, unaffected by human titles. Perhaps that is monarchy's greatest irony. The land remains. Only the roles change. Weeks pass. Public mourning continues with solemn dignity. The state funeral draws leaders from across the world. Bells toll again, this time in synchronized tribute. She walks behind the coffin of Charles III with measured composure. The world sees grief. Few see displacement. After the funeral, the transition accelerates. Clarence's house begins quiet renovation planning under the authority of the new monarch. Architectural teams review structural adjustments. Modernization proposals surface. The house is already imagining its next chapter. One evening, as twilight settles over London, Camilla stands in the entry hall of Clarence's house alone. No staff, no aides, just memory. She removes a small framed photograph from a side table, one taken long before crowns complicated their lives. This one is unquestionably hers. Footsteps echo softly behind her. A security officer informs her the gates will close shortly. She nods, then walks slowly toward the door. The camera lingers as she turns once more to look at the staircase. Not dramatically, just long enough to understand that when she next returns, it will not be as resident, but as guest. Outside, the car door closes with muted finality. The gates open, and then close again, not with hostility, with procedure. Weeks later, she settles into a smaller residence allocated for her continued status as Queen Dowager. Comfortable, secure, respectful, but not central, not sovereign adjacent. The walls are unfamiliar, the corridors shorter, the staff fewer. At night, the silence feels different, less historic, more personal. The camera pans across a desk where new stationery lies waiting. Updated crest, adjusted styling. Queen Camilla, no longer consort, no longer resident of the king's houses. The loss is not theatrical. It is cumulative, house by house, room by room, title by title. And yet, through it all, she carries herself with the same composure that once stood beside a throne. Because even as residences revert to the crown, dignity does not. Still, as she extinguishes the bedside lamp in her new home, one truth settles with unmistakable clarity. Without Charles, even walls no longer belonged to her. The silence in her new residence was not oppressive. It was revealing. In Clarence's house, silence had once meant rest between engagements, a pause before the next audience, the next briefing, the next shared obligation. Here, in smaller rooms allocated with dignified restraint, silence felt structural, as if something larger had stepped away. Morning light filters through tall windows. The camera moves slowly across a writing desk now bearing revised stationery. The royal cipher has changed. The seal no longer interwoven with that of a reigning sovereign. Queen Camilla, Dowager. The title had settled publicly with minimal friction. Newspapers adopted it. Broadcasters adjusted phrasing. The nation moved forward with respectful continuity. But inside the palace system, inside the machinery, another recalibration had begun, and this one was personal. In a conference room at Buckingham Palace, senior staff gathered beneath chandeliers that have illuminated centuries of transitions. The agenda is clinical. Realignment of household resources. The phrase alone suggests inevitability. The private secretary to the new king outlines the structural changes. Offices formerly designated to the queen consort's household will merge with central operations. Several roles will be absorbed, others reassigned. A small number retired. No hostility, no blame, only hierarchy asserting itself. Proximity to the sovereign determines gravitational pull. Without the sovereign, gravity shifts. Back at her residence, Camilla sits with her own private secretary, a man who has served faithfully for years, navigating press storms, charity tours, delicate negotiations. His tone remains composed. "Ma'am, we've received confirmation regarding staff adjustments." She nods once, already anticipating the content. Security detail will reduce from full consort tier to senior royal tier. 2 equerries will be reassigned to the king's household. Communication support will consolidate with central press office. Each sentence lands like a quiet subtraction. Security had never been theatrical. It had been protective, a shield built around the office she occupied. Now, threat assessments recalculated by the Home Office conclude that risk remains present, but diminished. The word carries a weight beyond safety. It reflects relevance. The camera cuts to a hallway once lined with aides waiting outside her office. Now, only one remains seated. In the weeks following the funeral of Charles III, the palace rhythm accelerates around the new king. Briefings multiply. Diplomatic cables arrive in steady flow. The new reign requires immediate stabilization. Staff follow momentum, and momentum has direction. One afternoon, she requests a meeting with her communications director, a woman who stood beside her during years when public approval fluctuated sharply. They sit opposite one another in a modest drawing room. "I've been offered reassignment," the director says gently. "To the new queen's office?" A nod. There is no resentment in the exchange. This is how monarchy sustains continuity. Experience migrates toward relevance. "You must accept," Camilla replies. And she means it. Loyalty in monarchy is not personal. It is institutional. The camera follows a communications director down a corridor she has walked daily for years. Her footsteps echo differently now, not as departure, but as transfer. Elsewhere, military equerries receive formal notification of redeployment. Colonelcies once associated ceremonially with Camilla revert to the sovereign's discretion. Ceremonial affiliations may appear ornamental to outsiders. They are not. They signify visibility within regimental life, symbolic leadership, connection to the armed forces. Without consort status, those affiliations require renewal by the king. Some are graciously maintained. Others are reassigned to younger members of the royal family. Faces align with the future. In the royal mews, liveried staff adjust carriage assignments. The number of vehicles allocated for her engagements decreases, not dramatically, but noticeably. One fewer outrider, one fewer support car. Hierarchy expressed through convoy length. Meanwhile, in offices near the throne room, her former staff gather quietly to discuss options. Retirement packages are reviewed, transfer letters drafted. A few younger aides view reassignment as opportunity. Older ones see it as closure. The camera lingers on a long-serving dresser, folding garments into archival boxes. She pauses over a coronation robe, heavy velvet, meticulously preserved. "That was a remarkable day," she murmurs softly. Now, that day belongs to history, not schedule. In a dimly lit office late one evening, Camilla signs letters of personal thanks to staff whose roles are ending. Her handwriting remains steady. Each letter is specific, gracious, acknowledging years of service. Because while titles fade, relationships endure, even if distance follows. Across the palace complex, security teams review perimeter maps. Adjustments are subtle. Entry protocols revised. Access credentials updated to reflect new reporting structures. The change is not a demotion. It is a repositioning. Still, as one seasoned protection officer removes a pin bearing the consort's cipher from his uniform, the symbolism is unavoidable. The circle tightens, then thins. The camera drifts into the central courtyard of Buckingham Palace at dusk. Staff move in purposeful diagonals, heading toward the king's private apartments for evening briefings. None move toward her residence, not because she is unwelcome, but because the center has shifted. One evening, she walks alone through a smaller reception room, now designated for her occasional audiences. The furniture is elegant but scaled differently. Fewer chairs, less space for advisors standing discreetly at the margins. She recalls how once, before state visits, a dozen aides would cluster near the doorway, adjusting schedules, finalizing talking points. Now, too, influence in monarchy is rarely declared. It is measured in how many wait outside your door. The following week, the Lord Chamberlain's office issues a formal notice. The household of Her Majesty the Queen Consort is hereby dissolved and integrated into the royal household under the authority of His Majesty the King. Dissolved. The word is final. The camera returns to her desk as she reads the notice. She exhales slowly, not in anger, in comprehension. For years, she had built a circle. Small, trusted, resilient. Individuals who understood both the fragility and discipline of her position. Now, that circle disperses into the larger orbit of a new reign. Later that afternoon, she requests tea with 3 senior aides whose contracts conclude at month's end. The room is quiet, intimate. No photographers. No formal minutes. Just gratitude exchanged without script. "You serve not only me," she tells them softly. "You serve stability." They smile, not sentimentally, but with pride, because service the crown, even in peripheral capacity, carries honor. As night falls, she walks through her residence once more. Fewer lights remain on. Fewer voices carry down corridors. The atmosphere has changed from operational to domestic, and domestic life in monarchy is a rare privilege. The next morning, her diary arrives, noticeably lighter. Engagement requests have slowed. Appearances will continue, but with recalibrated scale. Press interest narrows toward the new king and queen. Momentum favors youth, continuity, generational narrative. She understands this. Monarchy survives through forward motion. Yet in understanding, there is still adjustment. One final staff meeting is scheduled in the modest drawing room. No speeches are given. No tears allowed to dominate. Simply acknowledgement. At its conclusion, aides disperse. Some to new offices within the palace, others to lives beyond its gates. The camera remains fixed as the door closes behind the last departing staff member. Silence returns. But it is no longer institutional silence. It is personal. She sits alone for a moment, then rises, walks toward the window. Beyond the glass, the palace lights shimmer against the London night. Inside those illuminated walls, decisions continue. Meetings unfold. Influence circulates. But she now stands at the perimeter of that circulation, respected, consulted occasionally, no longer central. And yet, dignity remains intact, because monarchy, for all its hierarchy, reveres continuity of conduct, even when circles dissolve. As she extinguishes the lights one by one, a realization settles with quiet clarity. Influence is not lost in a single moment. It recedes in measured increments, staff by staff, title by title, door by door. The corridors no longer echoed with the urgency they once held. Where briefings had filled mornings and strategy meetings shaped afternoons, there was now space, deliberate, measured space. The disbanding of her household had been structural. This next shift would be subtler. It would not happen in meeting rooms. It would happen in headlines. 3 weeks into the new reign of Prince William, public attention had already begun its natural migration. Cameras clustered at the gates of Buckingham Palace, not for the Dowager Queen, but for the newly crowned couple representing continuity. Monarchy is narrative, and narratives favor beginnings. Camilla sat at her writing desk, reviewing a list of charitable patronages she had carried for years: literacy trusts, domestic violence shelters, osteoporosis research foundations. Causes she had chosen carefully, nurtured steadily, supported without spectacle. As Queen Consort, her name had drawn funding. Her presence had filled auditoriums. Her speeches, measured, compassionate, had carried institutional gravity. Now, each patronage required formal review under the new reign, not because her commitment had wavered, but because royal association is never permanent. The camera moves to a boardroom at a national literacy charity. Trustees gather around a polished table, discussing the letter received that morning from the royal household. The language is respectful. Her Majesty Queen Camilla will continue as patron in a private capacity, pending confirmation of revised royal alignment. Private capacity. The distinction matters. Royal patronage confers visibility amplified by the crown. Private support, though meaningful, carries less institutional projection. Funding projections adjust accordingly. At another organization, one she had visited dozens of times, staff watching news broadcasts announcing that several high-profile patronages will transfer to the new queen. The transition is framed as generational renewal. No controversy, no drama, just evolution. The camera returns to her residence. A communications aide, one of the few remaining, presents a revised engagement calendar. There are few requests this quarter, ma'am, he says gently. Media focus remains on Her Majesty's. She nods. Focus is finite. When she first assumed the role of Queen Consort, focus had been scrutinizing, skeptical, relentless. Over time, it softened into acceptance. Now it drifts elsewhere. That evening, she attends a small event for a domestic abuse awareness initiative she had long championed. The venue is modest, the crowd sincere. Flashbulbs are fewer, microphones fewer still. She steps to the podium. Her voice remains steady, not amplified by spectacle, but grounded in conviction. I have always believed, she begins, that quiet work often carries the deepest change. The words resonate differently now. Once, they were spoken from near the center of monarchy. Now, they emerge from its edge. And yet, the sincerity remains unchanged. The camera lingers on faces in the audience, volunteers, survivors, advocates. For them, her diminished platform is irrelevant. Presence matters more than prominence. But beyond the walls of that venue, national media leads with the king's first overseas visit, the new queen's early initiatives, the symbolism of youth and continuity. Public voice in monarchy is an ecosystem, and ecosystems rebalance quickly. Days later, a formal letter arrives from the royal household, confirming transfer of several ceremonial patronages to younger members of the royal family. The language is courteous, appreciative of her years of service. Still, as she sets the letter down, a realization settles. Causes she nurture will continue, but under new stewardship. The camera moves through archives where photographs from her consort years are being cataloged, speeches transcribed, exhibitions updated. In a media control room, graphics designers prepare a new website layout for the monarchy. The section once titled The Queen Consort is archived. A new section appears. The Queen. Visibility reorganized in digital architecture. Later that week, she requests a private audience with the new king. They meet in a sunlit room overlooking the palace gardens. I do not wish to compete for relevance, she tells him calmly, only to continue the work where appropriate. He listens respectfully. You will always have a role, he assures her, and she believes him. But she also understands the mathematics of attention. Monarchy cannot sustain multiple centers indefinitely. As spring approaches, invitations to state banquets become selective. Seating charts place her prominently, but not centrally. She attends, composed as ever, aware that cameras now pivot first toward a reigning pair. In a quiet moment between courses, she observes the choreography of a new era unfolding around her. Not exclusion, realignment. One afternoon, she walks alone through a gallery of portraits at Buckingham Palace. Paintings of former queens consort gaze outward, women who once stood at the height of influence, now preserved in oil and gilt frames. History does not forget them. It contextualizes them. A senior curator approaches. Your Majesty, the exhibition timeline will be updated to reflect the conclusion of His Majesty's reign. She nods. Portrait placement will adjust accordingly. Her image will shift from contemporary wing to historical sequence. Legacy begins the moment relevance transitions. Weeks pass. Her schedule stabilizes into a rhythm of select engagements, smaller audiences, focus initiatives, private meetings. There is dignity in reduction, freedom and less scrutiny. Yet occasionally, in the quiet of her study, she feels the absence of amplification, the knowledge that when she speaks now, fewer hear it. Not because her words lack substance, but because institutional microphones have turned slightly away. One evening, she revisits an early speech she delivered as Queen Consort, advocating literacy as empowerment. The language still resonates, but the audience she once commanded has evolved. The camera pulls back slowly. Outside her window, London hums with continuity. The monarchy remains stable, the crown secure. Her platform has narrowed, but it has not vanished. Still, the contrast is unmistakable. From center stage to respected elder, from amplified consort to measured dowager. The following month, a major charity announces a gala event. In previous years, her attendance would have been headline news. This year, the spotlight rests elsewhere. She attends quietly, supports sincerely, departs without spectacle. And as the car door closes behind her, she recognizes something profound. Public voice is not an entitlement within monarchy. It is a function of proximity. And proximity, once altered, reshapes everything. Back at her residence, she sits at her desk and begins drafting a letter to a literacy foundation she intends to support independently, without formal royal patronage. Her handwriting remains deliberate. If institutional platforms shrink, personal conviction can still expand. Outside, the palace lights glow against the night. Within those walls, the new reign accelerates. She watches not with envy, but with understanding, because she has lived long enough within monarchy to know influence fades, duty remains. The palace had grown quieter, not in sound. The rhythms of a new reign continued steadily within the walls of Buckingham Palace. But in historical focus, the language had shifted, the framing had adjusted. Where once the era was described as the reign of Charles and Camilla, it was now spoken of in completed tense. The reign of Charles III, past, contained, archived. In a climate-controlled chamber within the royal archives, gloved hands moved carefully over bound volumes, correspondence, state papers, personal annotations, and the king's unmistakable script. Alongside them, files labeled consort engagements, literacy initiatives, domestic violence advocacy. Camilla's work is preserved meticulously. But preservation is not prominence. The camera lingers on a curator, adjusting a small brass plaque beneath a portrait. The dates beneath the gilded frame are finalized now. 2022 to 2026. A complete reign. Her portrait, once displayed among contemporary figures, will soon shift slightly down the gallery wall, joining the historical sequence of consorts whose influence lived in proximity rather than authorship. There is no insult in this, only order. One afternoon, she walks slowly through that gallery. Sunlight filters through high windows, catching dust in suspended motion. Former queens consort gaze outward. Alexandra, Mary, Elizabeth, women who shape tone, not law, whose names are spoken in connection to kings. She pauses before a mirror placed between two portraits. For a brief moment, her reflection occupies the same gilded frame. Then she steps aside. Legacy and monarchy does not belong to individuals. It belongs to continuity. Later that week, a meeting is held at St. James's Palace to review exhibition revisions. The coronation regalia display will be updated, multimedia timelines recalibrated, digital archives adjusted to reflect completed chapters. A curator speaks gently. Your Majesty, we would like to include a section highlighting your literacy campaign milestones. She inclines her head. The work mattered. It still matters. But it will now be contextualized within a concluded era. The camera moves to a library table where early drafts of biographies lie stacked. Journalists begin shaping narratives. Analysts debate the tone of retrospectives. Was the reign transitional? Stabilizing? Reflective? And always, her role is measured relative to his. Consorts are rarely granted independent chapters. They are written into margins, elegant, essential margins, but margins nonetheless. At her residence, she sits near a window overlooking a smaller garden than the one she once shared at Highgrove House. The afternoon light is softer here, less ceremonial. She holds a copy of a commemorative publication marking the end of the reign. Her photograph appears beside his. The caption reads, Queen Camilla, devoted consort and advocate. Devoted. The word is accurate and revealing. Devotion is relational. It requires another. Without Charles, the identity of consort becomes historical description, not living function. Outside, London hums with the forward momentum of a new chapter. The reign of Prince William unfolds with modern cadence. New initiatives, new priorities, new language. The monarchy adapts as it always has, absorbing conclusion into renewal. In a quiet conversation with a senior archivist, she asks a simple question. How will this era be remembered? The archivist pauses thoughtfully. As steady, he replies. As transitional. As dignified. She smiles faintly. Steady, transitional, dignified. None of those words imply dominance. All imply support. That evening, she opens a small wooden box containing personal letters from Charles. Notes written long before crowns complicated their companionship. The ink is slightly faded. The tone unmistakably human. History will remember a king. She remembers a man. The camera lingers on her hands, resting over the letters. Shared sovereignty is a rare phenomenon. Intimate, yet public. When one half disappears, the other does not simply continue. It redefines. In the months that follow, exhibition plaques settle permanently into place. School textbooks update timelines. News retrospectives conclude with phrases like the late king. Her name appears less frequently in present tense, more often in reflection. One morning, she attends a modest unveiling of a portrait commemorating the reign. The artist has captured Charles in contemplative posture, gaze directed slightly upward. She stands beside the canvas, applause respectful but restrained. A journalist calls out gently, Your Majesty, how would you describe your years as queen consort? She considers the question carefully. I would describe them as service, she answers. Service. The word holds both humility and permanence. Because service does not expire with title. It accumulates. Later, walking alone through palace gardens open briefly for public visitation, she observes families reading informational plaques describing the late king's environmental work. Children point to dates. Parents explain transitions. The monarchy becomes lesson, not lived experience. She feels neither resentment nor longing, only clarity. The final loss is not title, not residence, not staff, not platform. It is authorship. She will not define the era. She will be defined within it. The camera drifts upward toward the palace skyline at dusk. Flags fly at full mast once more. The nation has resumed its steady rhythm. Inside her residence, she stands at a window overlooking the city lights. Reflection merges briefly with glass, her figure layered against London's glow. Monarchy endures because it is impersonal. Individuals inhabit it temporarily, then step aside. She understands this more fully now than ever before. Power is temporary. Duty is enduring. Legacy belongs to the institution, not the individual. As she turns from the window and extinguishes a lamp, the room falls into soft shadow. The era she shared is closed. Another advances, and in that advancing, she finds unexpected peace. Because while crowns may vanish and chapters conclude, dignity, when carried faithfully, does not require a throne.